I've done it again. Another trip to Japan and another profligate splurge on camera equipment. And if there's one question I do get asked more than any other, more even than if you farted and burped at the same time, would a vacuum form in your stomach? That question would have to be, Mark, is the Nikon 40mm f2 for the Z system just a cheap and cheerful standard lens for the budget-minded photographer? Or does it have that X factor that makes this naughty 40 the cheekiest bargain in the Z lineup? Well, today we're going to try and answer that question. I like small things. That's true of my sense of humour as well as my choice of camera. The fact is that most of my second half of 2024 involved a large amount of travel, and these days I don't have either the patience or the stamina to carry around a lot of camera equipment. Normally in Japan I'd be going micro four thirds all the way, but I was heading off to China after Tokyo and I wondered if my Nikon Z6 could offer better quality in not too large a form factor. Now, I've already got myself Nikon's 28mm f2.8 SE lens, which gives you plenty of width in a compact size, but I don't know, 28mm doesn't really excite me, but the Nikon 40mm has been calling to me since it was released, with the promise of something a little bit more standard, able to suck in a bit more light, but with the same small size. What wasn't to love about it? Well, the price for one. While not exactly a 58mm knocked, it does seem that since its release, the 40mm f2 has clung to its value harder than dried snot to a septum. Scrolling down through the TT Artisan and Viltrox substrata, there are no bargains to be found on the auction sites, and even my usual West Shinjuku haunts, while producing a plethora of 40s, didn't offer much in the way of second-hand savings either, and only map cameras seem to have one of the SE versions. Because of course I need the SE version to truly convey that geriatric hipster aesthetic when I'm out taking random snapshots of street corners and shop windows. Actually, having the SE version didn't really make much practical sense. The standard version gives you much the same lens, albeit in a rather nondescript black cylinder. And I already have the SE version of the 28mm, which looks exactly the same as the 40mm, so I knew even then that I wouldn't be able to tell them apart in my camera bag. But I wanted the special edition because I do hanker for that Nikon Z f2 that I know is just around the corner. And while I was tempted to go for the standard version, if it really did mean $100 Australian equivalent saving, I was still hopeful that I'd find the SE at a reasonable price. And I did. I had to head a bit further into the wild west of Tokyo to find it, specifically 2 stops west of Shinjuku on the Orange Line to Nakano, and to Fujiya Camera, where for less than half the going price in Australia, I was able to pick up this optical marvel. Full props to Fujiya as well, because they wrapped it nicely and gave me a Nikon calendar so I can count down the interminable days to death, or at least until the next time I can afford a new second-hand lens. Now, this isn't going to be a full review of the lens, partly because I just haven't had it long enough to really get familiar with it in all conditions. But the next night, I did head from my hotel in Gotanda to the heady streets of Shibuya to give it a bit of a workout. an okay start. As you can see straight away from the number of photos with people in them, the small size of the 40mm doesn't make for an intimidating combination on the Z6. I would not say it's discreet. You can tell from some of the photos that I certainly got noticed, but I managed to get a mix of candid and street portrait shots without getting my head kicked in. Though really, Tokyo has to be one of the safest cities in the world, and photographing people in Shibuya is like shooting fish in a barrel, so not the most challenging environment, but still one that gave a decent sense of how this lens performed. Now, you will have noticed that most of these photos were edited, so it does seem only fair to show my process in polishing turds or ruining potential. Take your pick. Though if you do look at the originals, you'll notice that they don't exactly jump out of the screen as portfolio ready. I'll show you what I mean. The following night, I took the 40 out to Shimbashi, just a couple more stops in a different direction on the Yamanote line, so a slightly different slice of Tokyo, trading young urban cool for more of a sad salaryman vibe. The suits gathering like wildebeest around the watering holes to blank out their miserable existences with Kirin beer and idle threats about what they were going to do to their bosses one day. And what you'll notice about these shots is that they're definitely more heavily processed than I'd normally do. And there are a couple of reasons for that. The main one is that I always err on the side of underexposure when shooting high contrast scenes at night. Normally I'd compensate about 0.7 of an exposure to avoid blowing out the lighting, which gives an image that's far too dark overall. The other thing is that if I want to shoot moving subjects, I'll often have my shutter speed set to around 400th of a second, which allows me to freeze the motion at the expense of a high ISO. Now, fortunately, the Nikon Z6 can pretty much see in the dark and handles high ISOs quite well. These days too, even with my less capable equipment, I can often use AI to salvage details while smoothing out the noise of my images. If you look at this example at ISO 12800, I probably wouldn't have used this before, but with the magic of Lightroom's enhance feature or your own favorite flavor of AI juice software, you can pretty much get a usable image out of a noisy mess. You'll see that I didn't go too heavy on the noise reduction, just so as to create an artificial smeary blur, and I even do a bit of old school noise reduction and adding some grain to add a bit of texture in there. Look, it's not a perfect solution, but if it saves an otherwise good photo, then why not? Of course, one of the advantages of the f2 is that I really didn't need to go to that level of sensor gain very often, but there were still times where a good image needed a lot of extra work. Like for this one, taken with a shutter speed of 500th of a second at f2 and with an ISO of 4500. So we probably have some room to edit without having to enhance, but as you'll see, there's a big difference between the highlights on the center left and the darker subject on the right. At the moment, that's way too distracting and takes away from the human element. So we'll have to fix that. But let's start with the colors first. Now, for my Tokyo night shots, I've been generally going for a more of a Kodachrome vibe, something that adds the punchy colours of a slide film, but without the Ken Rockwell cacophony of something like Velvia. I started with a freely available preset a few years ago that I've now customized beyond all recognition, but let's make a virtual copy so I can go back and compare and hit the magic button. And look, it's not rocket science. You'll see from the calibration tab that I've created a bit more color separation. The blues are a bit more teal, the orange is a bit more orange, without looking too much like an episode of Miss Scarlet and the Duke.
I haven't read that particular one, but I did enjoy Curse of the Crimson Shadow.
You'll see that's also replicated with the color mixer. With some slight hue shifts, you'll notice that the saturation isn't actually that high, though by bringing the overall luminance down, it does make for some deep colors. While the blacks are inky, you'll see from the tone curve that they're not pure black, instead capturing some of that muddiness that you might see in the dark areas of slide film. Finally, a bit of slide sharpness has been added, as well as some split toning, adding some purples to the shadows and yellowing out the highlights to complete that Kodachrome look. Like all presets though, I just treat this as a start. The image is still way too underexposed, even more so now. So let's add a little bit of light so that we can see what we're doing. I'll also just do a very basic white balance just to give some sense of the overall tones of the image that I'm playing with. My next thing is to straighten out the lines. Now, this isn't something that I always do, but I often find myself using the geometry of architecture to provide a designerly backdrop to my subject. And it's annoying when camera angles don't play ball and offset my vertical and horizontal lines. So I'll often go in and straighten them out a bit. The other thing, of course, is that the dominant part of the image is the shop lighting rather than the human being. It definitely needs some dodging and burning to draw the viewer into the right part of the photo. Now, this is definitely a slippery slope, but I'll start with a fairly innocuous linear gradient to bring down the highlights a little, and already that's a massive improvement. The next stage is something that I often try to avoid because it can bring some quite unnatural results. But let's go into our masking tools and select our salaryman so we can put a bit more emphasis on him, increasing the exposure a tiny amount. But as I said, this is a slippery slide down the color grading slope to Blade Runner 2049 territory, or even worse, Miss Scarlet and the Duke.
I apologize, that came out harsher than I expected.
But hey, this is a video about the Nikon 40mm rather than a dissection of my poor taste in photo editing. So let's just leave it there on the understanding that any atrocities that emerge from these photos is more likely an artifact of my heavy-handed Lightroom skills rather than a flaw in the lens itself. In fact, I have to say that the lens performed admirably. All the point of view footage was shot on the 40mm, and as you'll see, it was quite snappy in acquiring focus, and like all native Z glass, is remarkably quiet and with low focus breathing. So it's a good video lens, perhaps even a better video lens than a photographic lens, to be honest. At this price and size, you're not getting something optically perfect. In fact, I'd go so far as to say that this is a character lens. Personally, I don't mind that. You've got plenty of other good Z lenses, and the 50mm f1.8s is probably the one that comes to mind as the alternative if you're looking for something that's clean and sharp edge to edge. I suspect that this one isn't, though night shots on the street aren't probably the best way to test that. But certainly I'm happy with the sharpness at the center of the frame at f2, and I'd even go so far as to say that this may have some of that 3D pop pixie dust that you find in some simple low element designs. In any case, it's a lens that is plenty sharp enough, and I do like the way it renders, with the out of focus areas creating beautiful blur and blobs of light to show off the Tokyo night. And most importantly, it is small. Now, I could have worn the right dark suited camouflage to blend in with the wildlife, but I found that hugging along the rail line as I walked up along the sidings gave me all the discretion I needed with a lens this compact. I even managed to get close enough to one of the creatures to capture this, without having the sight of a big piece of glass scaring him away to rejoin the rest of his herd ambling up the izakaya. 6 favourites among the Nipponese menagerie, and I won't dwell on the choices, but maybe you tell me if you agree or not in the comments down below. Have I found a hidden gem? And even if so, have I turned it into costume jewellery by my not so light touch Lightroom work? Like, subscribe, comment, and help me to learn as I come to better grips with photo editing and the Nikkor Z 40mm f2. It's definitely a lens that deserves more testing, and I promise it will get its full exposure on this channel over time. Because to me, the 40mm is a keeper. Cheap, yes. Cheerful, yes. But the results belie the price tag. It may well now be my favourite street photography lens. But hey, let's not get too far ahead of ourselves. This isn't married at first sight, and we're still in the heavy petting stage of this photographic relationship. Later.